Iran has sent a new proposal to the United States through Pakistani mediators, reopen the Strait of Hormuz and end active hostilities, but push nuclear negotiations to a later unspecified date. Axios was first to report the details, citing a United States official and two sources with direct knowledge. Iran is offering to reopen the strait in exchange for the United States lifting its naval blockade on Iranian ports. Crucially, and this is why Donald Trump's national security team held a Situation Room meeting on this today, the Iranian proposal makes zero concessions on the nuclear program. Zero. Iran still has 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a short technical step from weapons grade with no civilian application whatsoever, as the Times of Israel noted. Trump has repeatedly demanded Iran surrender its entire enriched uranium stockpile and permanently end enrichment. Iran says no. The Iranian leadership, according to Axios, is deeply fractured on the nuclear question, but they agree on one thing: the nuclear card does not get played until the blockade ends and the war formally concludes. And why would Trump agree to that? Think about the leverage problem. The United States blockade of Iranian ports is the main pressure instrument Trump has. As NPR reported, the White House confirmed that Trump's team discussed the proposal this morning, but Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was careful to say they were not considering it, merely discussing it. Rubio appeared on Fox News and poured cold water on the proposal, describing Iran as being run by radical Shia clerics who are deeply fractured internally. That is not the language of an administration preparing to make a concession. But here is the uncomfortable truth for the Trump White House: the blockade is hurting everyone, not just Iran. According to CNN, Brent crude, trading at $60 a barrel at the start of 2026 and at $73 just before the strikes began, has now crossed $110. The End Fuel Poverty Coalition in Britain is calling for windfall taxes on energy companies profiting from the conflict. Consumer confidence in Germany is at a 3-year low. European and Asian allies, according to the Washington Times, are particularly bitter about energy shortfalls. And United States gas prices are now at $4.11 a gallon. Not catastrophic yet, but trending upward at exactly the moment Trump faces midterm elections in November. The Washington Post has reported that his lack of focus on the domestic economy is already spooking Republicans. This brings us to the diplomatic theater that played out over the weekend. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi spent 72 hours in a sprint that took him from Islamabad to Muscat to Moscow. He held talks with Oman's Sultan Haytham bin Tariq about the Strait of Hormuz. Oman, you will remember, is one of the two coastal states of the strait alongside Iran, and has historically played the role of quiet intermediary between Tehran and Washington. Then on Monday, as NPR confirmed, Araghchi flew to St. Petersburg and met Vladimir Putin directly, according to Russia's state news agency TASS and Iran's semi-official Fars news agency. Putin told Araghchi to convey his gratitude for a message from new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei and said the Iranian people were fighting courageously and heroically for their sovereignty. Putin has also pledged, according to Fox News, that Moscow will do everything it can to support Tehran. Now let us pause here, because what Putin said and what Putin is actually doing are two very different things. The Peterson Institute for International Economics makes this point with precision. Russia is sitting on the sidelines, not because it does not care, but because watching the United States bleed in the Middle East is a gift to Moscow. Before the Iran crisis, Russia's energy revenues were in free fall. Oil export earnings had fallen below $10 billion in February. The Kremlin was reportedly preparing 10% cuts to all non-security spending. And then the Iran war began. Global oil prices surged. According to the KSE Institute, Russia could receive between $45 billion and $151 billion in additional budget revenues in 2026 alone. Ellen Wald, president of Transversal Consulting, told CNBC bluntly, Putin's got to be thrilled because anything that raises the price of oil is good for him. She added, and this should concern every NATO ally, once it's resolved, Trump is definitely going to turn his eyes toward Putin next. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy makes the same point from a different angle. Putin's focus when calibrating support for Iran is not Iran itself, it is Ukraine. Every week the United States is consumed by the Iran war is a week Putin is not facing maximum American pressure over Ukraine. It is a strategic holiday for the Kremlin. And so Putin meets Araghchi, offers warm words, pledges support, and collects his oil windfall, all without firing a single Russian missile or committing a single Russian soldier. But we need to talk about China, because China's position here is more complicated, more consequential, and in the long run more important than anything Russia is doing. China has called the United States' blockade of the Strait of Hormuz dangerous and irresponsible. Beijing vetoed, alongside Russia, a United Nations Security Council resolution on the 7th of April that was drafted by Bahrain and would have called for freedom of navigation in the strait. and an end to Iranian attacks on shipping. The United Kingdom and the United States backed the resolution, China and Russia killed it, and the Peterson Institute analysis is important here. That veto was not an act of ideology, it was an act of rational self-interest. China is dependent on Iran for crude oil imports. It also requires commodities that transit the Strait of Hormuz. As CNBC reported, China's crude oil and gas imports fell in March from a year earlier. The disruptions from the war are already hitting the Chinese economy in measurable ways. Standard economic modeling, as the Peterson Institute notes, suggests China's gross domestic product falls by roughly half a percentage point for every 25% rise in oil prices. And oil has risen substantially since this war began. But here is the deeper strategic game China is playing, and Foreign Affairs magazine captured it most elegantly in a piece co-authored by John Altman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Ali Vaez of the International Crisis Group, published just this week. The argument is this: China and Russia are winning the Iran war without fighting it. Every dollar the United States spends, every missile it deploys, every diplomatic capital it burns in the Middle East is a dollar, a missile, and a unit of influence that is not being directed at China in the Indo-Pacific or at Russia in Europe. The Peterson Institute puts it even more starkly. The United States' plan with Iran was to mirror what it did in Venezuela. Quick, overwhelming, decisive. It has, in their words, backfired horribly. Meanwhile, let us not forget what China achieved in this region just 3 years ago. In 2023, Beijing brokered the Saudi Arabia-Iran rapprochement under its Global Security Initiative. That was a landmark. The Foreign Affairs piece argues that if the United States achieves dominance in Iran, dismantling its regional influence, installing a pliable regime, Beijing's hard-won diplomatic gains in the region would be undermined. China had pushed for Iran's admission to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and to BRICS, building a multipolar architecture to its liking. A decisive American victory in Iran would, as the Foreign Affairs piece warns, signal to the global South that China's security guarantees are hollow. And so China has every incentive to keep this war grinding, to deny America a clean win, to veto resolutions, to buy Iranian oil, to talk loudly about freedom of navigation while doing nothing to actually enforce it. The Mr. Geopolitics newsletter, run by geopolitics expert Abhishur Prakash, made a striking observation this week. The United States-China truce is destabilizing not over Iran or Russia, but over technology and capital. The semiconductor war, the artificial intelligence race, the battle over critical minerals, these are the fronts where the real great power competition is being fought. And the irony is sharp. While Beijing and Washington remain in managed competition, China's crude-driven windfall from the Iran crisis is giving it economic breathing room precisely when American businesses are squeezed by $4 gas and fractured supply chains. Now let us come to Israel. Because Israel's role in this crisis is not diminishing, it is expanding. Israel's military intelligence chief, as CNN reported this week, explicitly warned that 2026 may be a year of multi-front combat across Gaza, Syria, and Lebanon. The Israel Defense Forces are currently operating in all three of those territories simultaneously, and the ceasefire with Lebanon, which was brokered by the United States and extended for 3 more weeks just last week, is under enormous strain. CNN reported that Sunday was the deadliest day for Lebanese civilians since the ceasefire began, with 14 killed. The Lebanese Health Ministry says that since the 2nd of March, at least 2,509 people have been killed by Israeli strikes in Lebanon, and more than 7,700 wounded. Israel says Hezbollah has been violating the ceasefire. Hezbollah says Israel has been violating the ceasefire. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem has, as Fox News reported this week, officially condemned the Lebanon-Israel negotiations. And Rubio, when asked whether the United States is open to a scenario where Israel maintains a buffer zone indefinitely inside of Lebanon, said, and this is worth quoting precisely, "I think the ideal outcome here would be one in which you wouldn't need an Israeli presence. That is not a no. That is a very diplomatic way of not ruling something out." Meanwhile, in Gaza, there is something remarkable happening. The Palestinian Authority, for the first time in 21 years, has held local elections in both Gaza and the West Bank, as NPR reported on the 27th of April. Palestinian officials described this as a step toward a long-delayed presidential election. We are talking about a population that has lived through a devastating war, the near-total destruction of Gaza, the deaths of tens of thousands, and they are voting. They are insisting on democratic participation. That matters. Because it creates a political reality on the ground that any future peace agreement, any future two-state solution, any future American diplomatic push will have to reckon with. Let us talk about Pakistan, because Pakistan is playing one of the most consequential and underreported roles in this entire crisis. Islamabad is the site of the peace talks between the United States and Iran. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif held a 50-minute phone call with Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian this week, warning him about Iran's ceasefire violations. Pakistan is mediating between Washington and Tehran, walking a tightrope that its own analysts have described as perilous. The Geopolitical Monitor wrote this week that Pakistan's mediation is a high-stakes reflection of how middle power dynamics are evolving in real time. Success would dramatically elevate Pakistan's global standing. Failure could expose Islamabad to the very conflict it is trying to prevent. Crucially, Pakistan's ships have continued to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Islamabad came to a quiet diplomatic arrangement with Tehran, which tells you precisely how carefully it is balancing its relationships. Now let us turn to the United Kingdom and Europe, because they did not ask to be in this war, and they are in it anyway. British bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and Cyprus were all attacked by Iran in the opening weeks of the conflict. The Royal Air Force was deployed in a defensive capacity. Britain voted in favor of the Bahrain-drafted United Nations Security Council resolution on the Strait of Hormuz that Russia and China vetoed. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, in a joint statement with France and Germany on the 28th of February, condemned the Iranian counterstrikes and called for a return to diplomacy. Chancellor Rachel Reeves, as the Daily Mirror reported, has publicly called the Iran war a folly hitting British families. The United Kingdom, alongside the 32 members of the International Energy Agency, has released 400 million barrels of oil to bring prices down. It is not working. $110 a barrel tells you everything about how effective that has been. And there is a domestic dimension in Britain that is deeply disturbing. The House of Commons Library briefing published this week contains a section that deserves far more attention than it is receiving. Iran-linked groups have been conducting attacks on Jewish communities in the United Kingdom. A group potentially linked to Iran has claimed responsibility for an attack on 4 ambulances belonging to Hatzolah, a Jewish volunteer ambulance service, and for an attack on the Finchley Reform Synagogue. There have been threats against the Israeli embassy in London and against Iran International TV, a London-based opposition channel. The Metropolitan Police are investigating. This is not abstract geopolitics. This is an active state-linked campaign of intimidation on British soil. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the Mutual Defense Clause, defines an attack on one member as an attack on all. If a state actor is directing violence inside the United Kingdom, we are in legally and diplomatically uncharted waters. NATO, for its part, declined, as the House of Commons Library confirmed, to participate in securing the Strait of Hormuz when Trump requested Allied support. The alliance said it would not send forces during active hostilities. Trump later said their support was not required. But think about what that moment revealed. The United States launched a war that disrupted the global economy, asked its NATO allies to help manage the consequences, and the allies said no. That is not an alliance functioning at full strength. That is an alliance under quiet but serious strain. In Europe, there is one more story, easy to overlook in the noise of the Middle East, but which has enormous long-term significance. In Hungary, as Geopolitical Futures reported, Viktor Orbán has lost power after 16 years, with Fidesz defeated in parliamentary elections. Orbán was the most prominent pro-Putin voice inside the European Union, the leader who blocked European Union resolutions, who met with Putin while other European leaders refused to, who called Ukraine's war a conflict Hungary would not take sides in. His defeat is a seismic political moment, and it raises a consequential question. Will a post-Orbán Hungary align more closely with the European mainstream? And if so, does that shift the internal European Union balance in ways that complicate both Russia's and China's calculations? Finally, Africa. Because the world does not stop at the Middle East, even when the Middle East is on fire. Mali, as NPR reported on the 25th of April, experienced one of the most significant coordinated rebel attacks in years. Gunfire and explosions hit the capital Bamako and other key cities as Tuareg FLA rebels and Jaini militants, that is Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, Al-Qaeda's Sahel affiliate, struck simultaneously across the country. Mali's military government, which came to power through a coup and expelled French forces in favor of Russian Wagner Group mercenaries, now faces an existential threat. And here is the geopolitical through-line connecting Bamako to Beijing and Moscow. Russia's Wagner Group is deeply embedded in Mali's security architecture. If Mali destabilizes further, it is Russian influence in the Sahel that takes the hit. And it is European nations, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, that face the downstream consequences in terms of refugee flows, migration, and terrorist spillover. So let us bring all of this together. What we are watching is not a collection of separate crises, it is one interconnected storm. The United States has been drawn into a war in Iran that it expected to win quickly and cleanly, but which has instead turned into a grinding economic and diplomatic siege. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. Oil is at $110 and climbing. Iran's latest proposal, confirmed by Axios and the Associated Press, offers to reopen the strait but refuses to touch the nuclear program, which was the entire stated justification for the war in the first place. Trump, according to CNBC, is reviewing the proposal with his national security team. He appears to believe, as International Crisis Group's Iran project director Ali Vaez told CNN, that the blockade will bring Iran to its knees in days or weeks. That may be true. It may also be catastrophically wrong. Because here is the fundamental problem. Iran has 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. It has never in its modern history surrendered a nuclear card under military pressure, and the logic of nuclear deterrence, articulated by scholars from Kenneth Waltz to Zbigniew Brzezinski, tells us that the closer a state feels to the existential precipice, the harder it clings to whatever program it believes guarantees its survival. Asking a state that has just had its supreme leader killed by foreign airstrikes to voluntarily dismantle its most powerful deterrent is not a negotiating position. It is a demand for unconditional surrender. And history, from the Korean armistice of 1953 to the Vienna nuclear negotiations of 2015, tells us that unconditional surrenders from states with functioning governments, popular legitimacy, and outside patrons willing to offer economic lifelines do not happen quickly. Meanwhile, Russia is making billions. China is watching carefully, vetoing resolutions, buying Iranian oil, and preserving its options. Israel is fighting on 3 fronts and planning to fight on more. Lebanon is burning. Gaza has held elections but remains under occupation. Pakistan is on a diplomatic tightrope over a waterway that will determine whether global energy prices stabilize or spiral further. Hungary has just removed its most Kremlin-friendly voice from power. And Mali is under coordinated attack by jihadist groups in a Sahel region where the West's influence has collapsed and Russia's mercenaries have moved in. King Charles III landed in Washington today for a state visit, and one imagines that the conversations behind closed doors in the White House will be considerably less ceremonial than the public program suggests. This is where we are, not at the end of something, at the beginning of something. The question is not whether the world order is changing, the question is what it is changing into. Is it changing into a world where American military power can still impose outcomes, or one where adversaries have learned that by simply holding on and outlasting the political will of a democracy facing an election cycle, they can frustrate even the most powerful military on earth? Is it a world where China's patient, capital-driven strategy of building influence across the global south outcompetes American hard power? Is it a world where the rules-based international order, the United Nations Charter, freedom of navigation under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Non-Proliferation Treaty are simply dead letters, invoked when convenient and ignored when inconvenient? The honest answer is, we do not know yet. But the next few weeks are going to tell us a great deal. If Trump accepts a phased deal, Hormuz first, nuclear program later, he will be accused by his own base of surrendering his leverage and allowing Iran to keep its nuclear card. If he rejects the deal and escalates, he risks a wider war, oil at $150, and a domestic economy that his own party is already worried about heading into November. If Iran collapses under the blockade's pressure and concedes on the nuclear question, it will be the biggest American strategic victory since the Cold War. And if Iran holds out long enough for domestic American politics to force a de facto retreat, well, that will be the most consequential foreign policy failure since Iraq. The world is watching. You should be too. If you found this analysis valuable, share it with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening right now. Like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think the right move is: Hormuz first, nuclear program later, as Iran wants, or nuclear program first, Hormuz later, as Trump demands. Subscribe so you never miss an update. Because this story is moving fast, and the consequences are going to be felt in every home, on every fuel bill, and in every election for years to come.